Hello everybody and welcome to another Dwarf Fortress lore video. In this video I'm going to be reading the full story of Archcrystal, a very epic fortress that was created by a user named Sethados on the forums. So almost everything that I will be reading here is written in their writing, and they of course own all of the screenshots and everything that is written here. I'm simply presenting it for an audience. If you would like to read all of the content of these forum posts or the PDF that we will be reading from yourself, there will be links in the description. Before we dive in, I would just like to note that everything from Archcrystal is from a much older version of the game. So if you are currently playing version 50 on Steam, this might seem a little bit different, and the screenshots are obviously going to look different because Archcrystal was mostly played on version 40.24, which was released quite some time ago, and thus has a very different aesthetic presentation to version 50, which most people are the most acquainted with. The story begins at the year 200 some odd, but before I dive in, I would like to just note that this is a very long story. It's also worth noting that this is going to be presented in almost an audiobook fashion. There are screenshots that accompany the big walls of text, however they are rather few and far between in some stretches. So you might want to grab a cup of coffee or some tea, or alternatively boot up your copy of Dwarf Fortress and play while listening. Think of this like a video audiobook, or reading of fan fiction, which is largely what this is. So, get comfy and enjoy the reading of the legend of the 470-year-old fortress of Archcrystal and its invasion of hell. As Sethados writes, I have played my 40.24 fortress for 241 in-game years, and I hadn't set out to play a fort this long in June 2015 to present. Of course, this post was written in February 2016, and they write, within the first decade I had captured a breeding pair of cave dragons and wanted an army of them. I thought 1,000 years would simply take too long, so I decided on 200 years. And I figured they would be a good size by then. If you're unaware, dragons in Dwarf Fortress take up to 1,000 years to age to mature size, which means the younger ones can be quite weak. They make great war animals once they reach a certain size, and having them immune to fire really helps against fire beasts, as they're also immune to smoke, so they won't lose sight of their target. And the second reason is I never really had generations of dwarves in my fort before, so I put the population cap to 30 and the strict cap to 45 to get babies. My first 30 dwarves, I only had one married couple. This is Bomrek, the Waning Fence of Gales. I took this picture of him just before he died at age 170. He was the first militia commander of the fort with his wife Serral, Treaty Rims, the Dark Zeal. They birthed half of the fort. Everyone in the fort now was born there, and is descended from these two down through 5 generations. They are literally the Adam and Eve of the fortress. I accomplished this by getting one or more married couple to migrate, and then arranging marriages for their kids with the pre-honeymoon suites I set up. Long story short, by locking them in their bedrooms until they fall in love. After that, I got them to intermarry between cousins. The second youngest son of Bomrek and Serral, Melville, became king after a polite discussion with his rivals, about 100 years into the fort. So my family then became the royal family of the Dipped Spears. I was lucky that he didn't have any mandate likes, so I could keep the fort running at night. And here's some stats of the fort from throughout the years. Many of you may notice that this is very much the old school graphics, because Dwarf Fortress didn't always look the way it does now. Back in the day, it used to be a lot more just text heavy in a lot of the menus with very few images. Fortunately though, Sethados was using a tile set, so hopefully their screenshots will be visible to the majority of the people watching. But let's continue with the thread. The fortress lies in an evil jungle, the Jungle of Dying. It is a non-reanimating, but the clouds of wicked soot that roll through periodically and transform caravans and animals into husk zombies. For that reason, I burrowed everyone inside with a civilian alert from the get-go. There is a 4Z level waterfall where the 2 rivers meet, and the entrance to the fort is just north of here. Now, I didn't want them just wandering around doing nothing, so I had them decorate for over 2 decades. All of the furniture is made of clear glass, and it's all been decorated with everything we could find. That goes the same for finished goods, especially the large gems. And Sethados also talks about constructing up power and setting up an underground river using one of the cavern lakes, which is actually a favorite particular strategy of mine, taken from here. He also comments that there's no iron on the map, but they had lots of tetrahedrite and sulfurite. And they also got lucky with 3 adamantine spires. And getting ready to build the real fort, we've stockpiled thousands of clear glass blocks. At last, after a 142-year reign, King Melbel, the last son of the founders Bomrek Cradlecrafts, the waning fence of Gales, and Serral Treaty Rims, the Dark Zeal, died of old age, his daughter Libash inherited the throne. And it's time to build the clear glass fort of Archcrystal. And we're building this fort in Hell. It fell to Unib to dig through the last layer of the adamantine pillar. The Mad Queen Libash wanted her see-through fort to be amongst the swirling horrors of the underworld. The military was ready, and the giant war tigers would be used as bait, along with an artifact statue. An artifact door would hold back the initial attack to the killing floor. At last, the breach was made, and Unib was killed instantly, and the horde ascended. And that is the beginning of the grand story of the Siege of Hell of Archcrystal. The remaining portions of this story will be taken from the story as it stands so far, written in a 143-page document, which is linked in the description of this video if you would like to read it yourself. Of course, once again, everything that I'm going to be reading in this video is owned and originally written by Sethados on the Bay 12 forums. Unib was about to die, and she knew it. The dwarf steadied her steel pick and raised it high over her head, and brought it crashing down on the bright blue adamantine floor below the magma sea. She heard screams, and then nothing at all. When the breach was made, deep underground, Hell was open to the caverns, and the demons of the underworld raced upwards into the mortal realm. Only this time, it was on purpose. The Mad Queen Libash wanted her see-through fortress to be amongst the swirling horrors of the underworld, and the military was ready. The Great War Tigers would be used as bait, along with the artifact statue. An artifact door would hold the initial attack to the killing floor. Snarling and defending the spire with high-pitched screams, the hordes of demons raced towards the first large room of the dwarven fortress. At last they broke through the cinnabar doors into the snarl of giant tigers. Immediately the Marks dwarves opened fire. The first few demons fell instantly, to the legendary aim of the elite Marks dwarves, but more poured through the opening, slaughtering the great war tigers as they went. Bolt after bolt raced towards the monstrous targets as a seemingly endless stream of giant devils crashed into the room, throwing acid and spewing flames and spitting poison. Behind the back staircase, the melee dwarves waited patiently, alongside their cave dragon pets. They were gigantic monsters that were once dragons, now adapted to and polluted by the underground. The dwarves had bred these cave dragons for over 2 centuries for this moment. They could wait a little longer. Besides, they would be needed later. The battle lasted several hours with the demons, clawing futilely at the artifact door, and their bodies were shredded by the unmerciful projectiles, that the last of them were crawling and limping on the floor, still in their pursuit of mortal feast, until the horde was dead, having been relentlessly shot by the Marks dwarves while occupied with giant tigers, and one tiger even survived. Down the adamantine spire went the military, only 20 dwarves but backed by over 50 cave dragons. They hold the spire against the remaining demons down below, while the others work quickly to construct the stairs of glass. Now as they get ready to invade Hell, they'll soon find out that the demons have made a trap of their own. Doren Lashgrood, the longtime sheriff of Archcrystal, stood impatiently with his arms crossed at the bottom of the adamantine column, waiting for the staircase down to Hell to be completed. Moments before, the militia commander Thykot provoked one of the winged ash spiders flying past below. Thykot was webbed and killed in an instant, and his nephew was charged at the beast, sharing the fate of the descended militia commander before it was shot to death by a dozen steel bolts. That left 8 meat shields, calculated Doren, but no matter. The cave dragons would provide most of the cover for the sheriff's squad of elite marks dwarves, and Thykut was very old and wanted a warrior's death. He got it. Doren and his marks dwarves of the armored roads were different from the reckless axe and sword-swinging berserkers of the mountainous castles. Doran's squad was calm and methodical, and made in his own image. Efficient, cunning, and a touch of cruel. They were the ones needed for this kind of work, and now it fell to Doren to lead the attack. But he would have anyway. At least the stairs were finished, just enough. The melee dwarves of the mountainous castles raced down with a defending war cry followed by their gigantic cave dragon companions. Meanwhile, Doren waited with his crossbow squad calmly until the way was clear, and then led them in single file down the clear glass steps. His adamantine boots hit the alien stone ground with a muffled crush that kicked up a layer of ash into the air. The cave dragons found a demon, unfortunately made of snow, and they were playfully tearing it to pieces. Doren calmly walked forward and unfolded a portable chair and table pieces behind the crowd and sat down. Doren took out a pen and paper and began writing margins and numbers and calculating and quantifying what had been killed, the descriptions of various demons and their capabilities. Meanwhile, more cave dragons sprinted past his chair to join the others. He didn't concern himself with the small skirmishes taking place and remained documenting his work while his squad held its position, occasionally fired a few bolts here and there, and even the Mad Queen was striking at a stray water demon a few yards away, cackling wildly with every thrust and parry. Suddenly Doran's pen stopped. Its constant scribbling. Something was wrong. He could sense something shift on the horizon. A hidden vibration, a low rumble. He readied his crossbow and told his squad to do the same. Quickly, over the horizon, a new horde crested the ridge, at least 30 in number. They had been waiting until dwarves touched to the ground to launch a second attack. Perhaps the demons weren't so easily tricked. Fine, thought Doren. We shot them on our own terms, and he loaded his crossbow. Time to shoot them on theirs. The fury of the demons crashed like an ocean wave against the cliffside of dragons and dwarves. Bolts snagged through the air, finding plenty of homes, and great billows of smoke rose from the searing crash of fireballs from the burning brutes against the cave dragons' impervious scales. Doren once again could not help but remark how tough the cave dragons were. They took an astonishing amount of punishment from the demon onslaught before going down. It left them time for bolts, or the odd spear or axe to find its target. The Mad Queen Libash laughed hysterically and waded through the chaos, swinging her axe with insane glee. Finally, she bled to death from burns, and they say you can still hear her haunting voice echo off the pits of hell, trying to convince herself to not feel vengeful, each time getting softer until it's lost on the brimstone wind. The dwarves at the top of the stairs saw the queen fall and quickly proclaimed her brother Yushrir king. He had some mixed feelings on the proclamation, and Doren and his squad maintained their composure, occasionally going upstairs for more ammunition. They rhythmically shot bolt after bolt at the gnashing crowd until at last things grew still. One last horned banshee withered on the ground, trapped by clenching jaws of the cave dragons. The sheriff slowly walked to the struggling demon and whispered, "Filth," and gave it a final kick in its head and clapped its skull. "This is our home now." Doren looked up to where they had come down, and already the glassmakers began to do what the dwarves did best. 4th of Sandstone, year 314. 242nd year of Archcrystal. Moldath and Iton. It had been over a year and a half since Doren the sheriff last laid eyes on a demon, and it had disturbed him increasingly. He didn't like not knowing things, and he didn't like peace through ignorance. The glass walls continued to go up. They had to be very high to reach the semi-molten rock ceiling. But if he was honest with himself, he would feel safer if there was something attacking them. At last, he had enough, and sent for Moldath and Eiton. Moldath and Eiton were the last two surviving members of the mountainous castles. The new militia commander who led them was just 12 years old, so they were training her more. Then she was training them. While Moldath and Eiton weren't terribly smart, they both had an awful memory. They were incredibly lucky, and seemed to elude disaster as well. Doren couldn't quantify a talent like that, but he couldn't ignore it either. He sent them out to have a look around hell. Etur, the 12-year-old militia commander, insisted that she come along, so off they went with their tiny officer. Because they were only 8 years apart, Moldath and Eiton acted like sisters to each other. Even though Moldath was Eiton's great aunt, it was fairly commonplace in Archcrystal, a place where everyone was related, from intermarrying between cousins for centuries. Every dwarf in Archcrystal could trace their lineage back to Bomrek and Serral. They moved quietly away from the cave dragons and moved to the south. The 12-year-old Etur, wide-eyed and gawking at the eerie glowing pits of hell. They carefully climbed to the far southern ridge, and when it seemed clear, they went down the other side. A large glowing pit lay further south, and they stopped to look and listen. All was quiet. Moldath and Eiton looked at each other, sharing their thoughts through long recognized facial expressions. They were puzzled. They looked at Etur, her armor and helmet far too long for her small frame. Moldath smiled, but Eiton frowned. "What's wrong?" Moldath whispered. Eiton quietly pointed at Etur's shoulder, where a pile of dust was slowly starting to gather. They followed the tiny dirt waterfall upwards. Straight above was one of the other 3 adamantine spires. This one, though, was hollow, almost all the way to the top. Their underground vision served them well here, as they could see up almost 20 stories into the shaft. And there they saw movement, a wing flutter, an eye glint. "They're up there," Eiton whispered. "What are they doing up there?" whispered Moldath. "I don't know." "Are they trying to dig?" replied Eiton. "Demons can't dig, dumbass," says Moldath. "How do you know?" says Eiton. "Because I'm older than you," says Moldath. "But by only 8 years," replies Eiton. "And 2 generations, remember?" says Moldath. "Yeah, well, your generation is out of touch," replied Eiton. "Well, your generation is spoiled," says Moldath. And then just a small pebble stone hit the ground, and a larger rock almost landed on Etur, and they all crouched silently and looked up for danger. After a few minutes, Eiton said, "Let's get out of here." "Good idea. What do we tell Doren?" says Moldath. "I don't know. We just saw what we saw, I guess. Let him figure it out," says Eiton. So they left to tell the sheriff, with the militia commander skipping behind them. Doren, the sheriff, sat in the king's chambers and breathed in sharply before speaking. "The channel is dug, sire, and I fail to see why we had to tap another underground lake. You intended to see your sister's plan through, I understand." "Yes, I do," the king replied. "A clear glass fort in hell. It's ambitions." Doran's eyes flashed. "Indeed, but I have much larger plans than my dear departed sister," said the king. "Is that why we are dumping water on the magma sea?" says Doren. "Yes, we are going to turn much of it to stone, and then dig down through it. At the same time we dig up through the semi-molten rock from hell," the king smiled. "You want to connect hell with the third cavern?" says Doren. "Yes," said the king, "and much, much more." The king rolled a large parchment scroll onto the table. "Behold! We'll connect hell with the surface. We will dig a large hole all the way down and raise the clear glass spire from the underworld through the top of the jungle, so that the sun will shine into hell through our glorious glass tower." Doren was speechless. It was rumored that the demons raised towers of Slade from hell to their dark fortresses on the surface, but could the dwarves do the same with glass? Such a plan would take decades, said Doren. "Good," said the king. Doren the sheriff nodded and left, and he had his orders, and he liked the challenge, so he gave the order to the dwarves to start pouring water into the magma sea so that they could start digging. The 10th of Limestone, year 318, the 246th year of Archcrystal. Pure Bloodlines. Doren the sheriff stepped outside of the front gates into the haunted jungle and took in a deep breath. Unlike other dwarves, he didn't mind being outdoors, at least for a time. The first task he had was to inspect the recently cleaned entrance. A few months ago, a human caravan tried to leave while a thick cloud of wicked soot swiftly rolled past the entrance, and the results were disastrous. The zombie husks quickly turned on each other, and a few cave dragons at the entrance became infected in the fighting, and they turned into monstrous killing machines, tearing apart the remaining merchants and animals before being engaged by the militia. The resulting fight was brutal. Edom sustained a few injuries and lost her nose. Fortunately, she wasn't infected and able to continue with her duties, not the least of which was birthing more children. But still, it was a terrible loss of 6 cave dragons that were nearing 250 years old and were born close to the founding of Archcrystal. The cleanup had taken months, and only just now was the entrance appearing normal again. Doren ran a gloved finger across the floor before inspecting it close to his face. Finally, nodding to himself, he walked over to a spot in the grass just outside and unfolded his portable chair and table underneath the guava tree. He gathered his parchments and signaled to his guard he was ready. Several of them moved north into the jungle. It was Migrant Day at Archcrystal. Every year, refugees fleeing goblin groups such as the Exiled Flay or the Feral Doom would brave the treacherous journey through the haunted jungle of Drying. They attempted to reach Archcrystal to find a safe home, and every year it was Doran's job to turn them away. The royal family wanted to keep Archcrystal's bloodline pure. They had become steeped in tradition, idolizing the fort's great ancestors, Bomek, Cradlecrafts, and the waning force of Gales, and Serral Treaty Rim's the Dark Zeal. They now believed that anyone not descended from Archcrystal's founders were not worthy of entrance, and developed a strict no-immigrant policy. After 246 years, it was almost a religion now. But it was not something they revealed to the world. Instead, the sheriff would screen the refugees attempting entrance to find something, anything, wrong with them. Too short, too fat, too tall, too skinny, hair not copper enough, eyes not emerald enough, too young, too old, suspicious, too poor, too desperate, too many tears on their faces. Doren the sheriff did his job with ruthless efficiency. It's not to say he agreed with the policy. His analytical mind could see problems arising with a focus so narrow, but Doren committed to his tasks. It was just the kind of dwarf he was. So the guard would advance a short ways to the north where the refugee camp had formed next to the river, and bring forth the poor souls to be screened. One by one, they were all turned away, sobbing, into the jungle. Archcrystal was in the center of the haunted jungle, far away from the rest of the settlements of the Dipped Spears. Of course, they probably wouldn't last long out there, especially so close to the goblin settlements of the Feral Doom. The Feral Doom had expanded rapidly in the last 246 years from their fortress of Hate-Joined. They began with 6 settlements and had ballooned unchecked to 50, as they pushed west into the humans and south into the elves. The fear among the other nations was that they would connect forces with their brethren, the exiled Fly to the west. The exiled fly had expanded even more rapidly, destroying fortress after fortress of the dipped spears, causing a flood of refugees to seek sanctuary elsewhere to the east. Most would become slaves of the goblins, and the rest were less fortunate. And all the while, Archcrystal sat silent, tucked away within the dense jungle, seemingly hidden from the world's troubles. Its royal family focused inward, both within themselves and within the rocks. Doren finished the last of the documents, sending the last migrant away. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, and lost her family to the armies tearing the world apart. Doren felt a small hint of guilt creep into his chest. He took another long breath of air. It tasted foul. Another horrifying cloud must be on the way, he thought as he rolled his eyes at himself. "Lass!" he shouted. The child turned towards him, questioningly. "That way!" He signed and pointed to the caravan cresting the hill, on its way out of the jungle. Her eyes brightened, and she blew him a kiss, and ran towards the wagons. Doren grumbled before shuffling inside. "I'm getting old," he thought. "Better watch out, or I'll become human." 22nd of Timber, year 318, 246th year of Archcrystal. Icy Glass Walls. Doran's Mark's dwarves crouched silently along the rough adamantine rock face. They were tuned intently on the mark in the floor where Asob was going to die. A hole just below them was a pack of 20 or so demons lying in wait to ambush them. Opposite the Mark's dwarves, standing out in the complete open beside the mark in the floor, were Moldath and Iton. They were chatting loudly, oblivious to any tension in the air. "How many demons are there this time?" asked Moldath loudly. "Shouldn't you know? You're older and you know everything, remember?" replied Iton. "That doesn't mean I can see through walls," says Moldath. "Well, this is the floor," Iton replied. Moldath says, "A floor is just a wall that's horizontal. It's the same thing." And Iton says, "That's the dumbest thing you've ever said." Moldath replies, "You're the dumbest thing I've ever said." Iton responds, "That doesn't make sense either." "Of course it does," says Moldath. "I've said Iton before. There, the dumbest thing I've ever said." "You have absolutely no timing or delivery," says Iton. "Good! I didn't say it for you," says Moldath. "Good!" says Iton. "Good, then," says Moldath. It went on like this for some times, and Doren the sheriff rolled his eyes. Maybe this time they would get eaten. Somehow he knew he wouldn't be so lucky. At last, Asob was ready to make the final cut in the stone floor. With the pick in one hand and a baby in the other, she looked to Doren, who paused briefly before nodding. The Mark's dwarves took aim, and the final cut into the floor was made. The stone crashed through the floor and bounced heavily off of a few large demonic bodies below. Asob quickly fled up the stairs with her baby to safety, and a moment later, several demons screamed through the opening and were met with a hail of well-aimed crossbow bolts. Moldath and Iton had barely stopped talking before the sisters at heart began slashing their swords through the monstrous masses. They seemingly went into a trance-like state while fighting. The two swordsmasters acrobatically leapt over one another, twirling and flipping in the whirlwind of blades and strikes. More steel bolts rained down on the ascending demons in rapid succession, but a Mark's dwarf, Zasset, advanced too quickly for a clean shot and was grabbed and pulled below by a lightning-fast salt phantom, where he was overwhelmed quite quickly. Doren shouted angrily through gritted teeth, "Hold your line, you filth, or next one gets thrown in," and Moldath and Iton continued their dance of destruction until finally their spinning blades had no more moving parts to cut. They looked around at the carnage of severed limbs and demon body parts before smiling at one another. "I think they're all dead," they announced simultaneously to the sheriff. After a thorough search, it was determined that there were no more demons in the area, and shortly after the battle, the walls were completed. An artifact door was placed at the sole entrance to the fort, just in time as more demons began to appear outside of the glass barriers. The other dwarves began working quickly at the entrance hall for the new fortress. Furniture that had been decorated for centuries was just now being put into place. The glass fortress in hell had begun to spread outward from the center, like an icy virus within an unsuspecting host. Meanwhile, Aviz Girder Whip had a lot to do. She was the unofficial chief engineer of Archcrystal. She directed construction of clear glass workshops, as well as the placement within the fortress below. She spent ages with pen and paper plotting things out, only to realize she'd made a mistake here, or a miscalculation there, and everything would have to be moved and replaced. But the fortress was progressing nonetheless, and the bedrooms were now numerous enough to move the general population down to hell. There was a new dining hall constructed with future plans to host guests and rent rooms. Ornate windows were placed on the west and east sides that would eventually allow patrons to view the waterfalls that would come down through the chasm. Magma on the west wall and water on the east wall. Magma would be used for the forges, while the water would be for wells and the hospital. These would be powered by the underground river that the dwarves had made to turn water wheels. And above them were carefully placed holes in the glass tower that were now 5 levels high. 5 levels down, and 142 to go. Avuz narrowed her eyes, and she did not enjoy a challenge. She also knew that little by little her presence would prevail, and she leaned on a clear glass statue. In the new main hall, it was a beautiful depiction of Bomrek cradle crafts, the waning fence of gales, made over 200 years ago. All the dwarves in Archcrystal could trace their lineage back to him and Cyril, and his wife Cyril, Treaty Rims, the Dark Zeal, which made for confusing familial relationships. The statue, like all the others, told wonderful stories to those who looked. Somehow, knowing that there was a long, storied history to all of these pieces, gave her the resolve to continue with their enormous puzzle. First of Granite, year 322, 250th year of Archcrystal. A new hell. Doren the sheriff shifted uncomfortably. In his new armor, the king bestowed a new title upon him, Captain of the Guard. There had been a baby boom since the walls went up in hell, securing the fortress and 53 dwarves now called Archcrystal home. So the king decided on a few grander titles. King Yushrir elected himself mayor and decided to give the guardsmen a little more pomp and circumstance. Doren preferred to present himself modestly and frowned on any flashy accoutrements, but an important day was almost upon them. It was almost the 250th anniversary of the fortress. Offerings were planned to the gods, as well as games and tests of skill. Doren, who was rarely happy or enthusiastic, was conflicted by this, as he valued parties and merrymaking in the abstract. But he would grumble internally, but put on a good show. On the first day of spring, the celebrations began. A Rutherur was slaughtered, one for each of the dwarven gods. The cave dragons were decorated with war paint on their gigantic bodies, with great colorful flourishes of purple plump helmet and blue dimple cup. The new glass dining hall in hell was well established, with large silk banners woven from red and green demon webs. A great feast was prepared, and many children skipped towards the dining hall with wide-eyed anticipation. Before the feast, the entertainment was set to begin, as Doren and his newly regaled fortress guard marched and paraded away from the dining hall towards the glass entrance into the rest of hell. For months, the demons had started to gather at the artifact door, seemingly hypnotized by the great dwarven entrance. The fortress guard stepped onto their positions across from the fortifications. They ceremoniously formed 2 rows, one in front on one knee and one in the back standing as they readied their crossbows. The king rang a large brass gong, and the Marks dwarves opened fire. A great cheer went up from the crowd in the dining hall as they watched the volley rip through several of the targeted demons. These were some of the few demons made from flesh, the great petrosaurs, and they howled with anger, and as the bolts struck them. Volley after volley tore through muscle and bone as they attempted to shield themselves in vain with their wings and other appendages. Opened arteries gave satisfying spurts of blood like synchronized fountains splattering on the glass walls and staining the slayed floor. The onlookers and merrymakers watched with glee while feasting on the same flesh which they were watching get ripped apart before their eyes. Juicy fat dripped down their chins of the children as they hollered and whooped every time Doren barked, "Fire!" And they laughed as a leg came off, causing a demon to stumble. They taunted as one desperately tried to shield itself behind another, and they clapped wildly as steel bolts ripped apart the demon's midsection, spilling putrid guts. And they cackled as it warily tried to put them back inside its body, while struggling to avoid another flurry of shining steel. As the last demon lay dying, the crowd at the feast cried for more. Chanting and clapping, great pools of blood and twitching corpses were all that remained in the entranceway. They turned back to their feasting and gorging themselves on succulent roasts of demon flesh, and they watched as the butchers dragged the corpses inside with heavy iron hooks, one by one carving the large bodies and bringing the cuts of the best meats to the king before feeding the other slices of juicy flesh. The celebration continued in the glass hall. The bone carvers made toys and jewelry from the bodies and teeth of the petrosaurs and large totems from their skulls to adorn the hallways. The statues of the ancestors who came here 250 years ago looked on as the soft, eerie glow of the pits cast a pale light on the descendants and the voracity of the dwarves of Archcrystal in their new home. 4th of Granite, year 332. 260th year of Archcrystal invasions. Since the Great Feast 10 years ago, progress on the Fortress of Clear Glass was steady but slow. The glassmakers worked day and night building blocks with dwarven precision to create the floors and walls within Hell. The magma pit was complete, and the floor above it was half finished. The great tower of clear glass rose from the center hall, and was now through the semi-molten rock and climbed through the magma sea. Soon, magma would fall from the sea into Hell to power the forges. Archcrystal was experiencing a baby boom as well. 89 dwarves now called the fortress home, all of them born and raised in the underworld. Some of them 6 generations removed from the founder's 39 children, and ran through the deep glass halls alongside the eerie glowing pits, watching the demons swirl around the fortress. They ate and drank the cooks and brewers into a constant state of fluster. They worked constantly beside the glassmakers to meet up with demand. And Moldath and Iton were training some of the new recruits who had finally grown large enough to put on armor, when there appeared a visitor at the entrance. It was the strangest elf that Moldath had ever seen, and he was early to begin trading. "Hello?" asked Moldath, squinting. "Are you lost?" asked Iton. The creature charged at the 2 dwarves, and they looked at each other questioningly and raised its spear above its head, before Moldath sent its head from its shoulders in one quick slash. The body skidded to a halt on the smooth chalk floor. Outside, they could hear movement. Whatever this thing was, there were more on their way. A vile force of darkness has arrived. The group rushed to the entrance, but they were no match for the battle-hardened dwarves and brutally sharp weapons of adamantine. The battle was quick, and Moldath and Iton stood above the goblin bodies, examining their facial features, with the wide-eyed look of children discovering their first insect. "At least it's not as much of a mess as the zombie husks," says Moldath. They had never seen a goblin before, though many depictions existed of them in their furniture. From decorating the floor, they looked smaller in real life. 18th of Opal, year 339, 267th year of Archcrystal. The Factory. Avasgruder Whip, the chief engineer of Archcrystal, was beginning to see some of her work take shape. The forgers were ready for magma to be brought down, and work was nearing completion on the factory floor for other workshops. More bedrooms had been made, and magma ducts and aqueducts of glass began to criss and cross below in order to take liquids through the fort when they were ready. The work was painstakingly tedious. To make enough clear glass blocks for everything, it took 100 blocks to make a simple 10 by 10 floor, and that was a month of production time. But at least it was steady. 15,000 clear glass blocks were used so far, and the new glassmakers were getting better at making more. The population was growing, and more children were getting old enough to take on meaningful tasks. The glass tower, which was 22 stories now, was about to reach the lowest cavern layer, and preparations were being made to bring magma to one side and water to the other. Avuz designated glass pumps one floor above to suck the liquids through the grates to avoid any creatures getting into either liquid flowing through the inside of the fort. When it was finished, it would create a magma fall down one side and a waterfall down the other side of the tower, and bring water and magma down into the fortress. Avuz checked on the constructed underground river to make sure that there would be enough power from the water wheels. Grimy with grease and dirt on her face, she directed traffic superbly and wasn't scared to get into the tough areas of work, as finally the pumping system was taking shape. Finally, as the last mechanism was slotted into place, she gave the word for the glass crew pumps to be turned on, and the magma was sucked through the tubes like molten sunshine, bathing the fortress in light on its way down into hell. Next was the water. The aqueducts not only had to feed the walls in the hospital, but they also had to run far enough to irrigate the farms. Building these took more effort and time, and Avuz wanted to avoid costly mistakes. At last, covered in axle grease, yet again, she gave the order for the water pumps to be turned on. As the water flowed towards the farming plots, they were about to find out if plump helmets and cave wheat could grow in hell. Simultaneously, Avuz also had to deal with King Yushrir's demands to divert the resources, building his new private bedchambers in the northwest, as well as his new throne room directly below it. Avuz designated the magma moat to cover the throne room in shadows cast by the dwarven statues, and they all seemed to stretch long flickering hands towards the center of the room, reaching for whomever would stand before the king of a new hell. Third of Limestone, year 352, 280th year of Archcrystal. Hidden enemy. Doren Lashgroove, the sheriff of Archcrystal, hurried up the glass staircase from the fortress in hell. He didn't have to climb many floors, which was odd given the nature of the emergency. A dwarf had become exposed to the wicked soot clouds that roamed the evil jungle, which wasn't unheard of. It happened from time to time when someone ventured out carelessly. But this circumstance was strange, in that the dwarf had turned into a mindless husk far below the surface, close to hell. He arrived at the crime scene, flanked by his fortress guard. The two soldiers who had to put Eurus down stood beside the body, ready to give their report to the concerned sheriff, who methodically eyed their surroundings during the debriefing. He nodded to the soldiers and reminded them to clean their weapons, for when a husk zombie was slain, the soot could still contaminate. A small amount, even touching the skin, was enough to transform a good dwarf into a mindless killing machine. "How did it get this far down?" he grumbled, more to himself than the guard beside him. They were close to the magma sea, miles below where the clouds on the surface could penetrate. Doren knelt beside the body of Eurus, a young dwarven glassmaker, not yet 20 years old. His loss would be felt, as the glassmakers were deeply respected in Archcrystal. Something had made its way this far down, a rat or some other vermin perhaps, though there was never an instance before of this ever happening in the long history of the Eternal Fortress. Doren hated mysteries, and he was a dwarf of calculation and certainty, and his intuition was ringing alarm bells that he couldn't decipher. It was a paralyzing feeling tainted with doubt, and he hated the idea that something nefarious or hidden held the possibility to bring down his ancestors' glorious work from within behind the shadows. "Question everyone who last spoke with Eurus and clean the damn body," he barked, and his guards jumped to action. One of them brought his wooden folding table and chair, and Doren sat to his task of recording everything his mind could think of. Grumbling with no definitive conclusion, Doren retired to get some much-needed sleep, and it didn't last long. He awoke an hour later to shouting in the halls, an unmistakable sound of combat. Grabbing his crossbow, he burst through the door to the workshops to see another husk zombie engaged with one of his guards and a furnace operator. Both dwarves were skilled and armed, but the crazed husk dwarf was ruthless in its attacks, clawing and lunging quickly at the defenders. Bolts rained down on it from Doren until at last enough well-aimed projectiles collapsed its knees, and it fell clawing and writhing to the glass floor. The hammer that came down, crushing its head, ended its existence with an audible thud. All was silent for a time. The air was filled with tension as Doren approached the corpse. Alerted but calm, this was now a crisis. 2 dwarves in 2 hours infected far away from each other below the surface was a threat that hadn't existed before, and now more than ever, he felt the alarmed intuition tug at his reason with urgency. This was important, and it must be solved before more of them turned. "Clear out!" he yelled. "Nobody touch it!" He talked with the guard and the furnace operator as he inspected the body. Both of them reported that the victim was fine a few minutes earlier and had not been near the surface in months. He was fully clothed as well, with gloves and shoes, so there was little chance of any residue getting on his skin. Doran's brain was an inferno of frustrating possibilities, burning through the thoughts, one after another. As with all of the dwarves in Archcrystal, the victim was a member of the militia and was on duty for martial training at the time he was transformed. There had to be a connection between the 2 victims he wasn't seeing. "Kib," Doren mentioned for one of his lieutenants. "Check the training logs to see if the first victim was on military duty when he died." The guard's dwarf moved quickly to the militia commander's office as Doren meticulously laid out the second victim's belongings on a wooden folding table. Moments later, the guard's dwarf returned. "Sir, Eurist was indeed on duty at the time. What does it mean?" And Doren nodded. "I'm not sure yet." Kib joined Doren, looking through the victim's belongings, and remarked, "You don't see these very often." And Doren raised an eyebrow. "What?" And Kib pointed at the small seed on the table. "That seed, sir. I'm a herbalist when not on duty. That's a squash seed. We definitely don't grow these down here in hell." And Doran's mind raced. Finally, there was a puzzle piece that didn't fit. Doren grabbed the first victim's backpack and dumped it onto the floor beside the table, quickly searching until he found what he was looking for, a small seed. "Where would they get the squashes from?" Doren exhaled, as his eyes narrowed. "I know," the furnace operator spoke up. "Remember the human caravan a few months back? They walked right into one of those clouds and tore each other apart. Not uncommon for those idiots from the Confederacy of Finding to wander right into one of them like blind cave bears. They had a whole wagon of squashes to trade. Idiots! These 2 must have grabbed a couple of them before we burnt them up," Kib said. Doran stood thinking. That's how the contamination was getting past their clothes. They were ingesting it. Maybe. He thought thoughtfully. Who was in charge of the burn? Kib answered. Rovod the bookkeeper. All of their eyes suddenly lit intensely, as they all said in unison, "He's in charge of the rations." They all raced towards the bookkeeper's office, and Doran burst through the door. "Where are the squashes?" What squashes?" said Rovod, meekly. "There is no time for this. Tell me where they are, or more people could die." What, die? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I love squashes. I couldn't bear to burn them. They looked clean. I gave them to everyone in the military training for their rations." Doran's jaw dropped to the floor. "Kib, how many dwarves are scheduled for martial training today?" 59, said Kib. They hurried out the door, and Doran barked orders as they moved. "You 3, take the barracks down there. Kib, I will go to the one near the surface, and hurry. They are all ticking traps waiting to go off." Doran and Kib had to climb the entire length of the tower to reach the regulars training near the top, and they moved quickly and with purpose. They charged through the doors, and before Doran could say anything, Kib leapt across the room and batted a squash away from a soldier's yawning mouth moments before it was too late. "Hey, I was going to eat that, said the soldier, and Doren ignored the soldier and shouted, "All of the squashes on the floor now." When Doren commanded, everyone listened. They all jumped to attention and followed his orders, placing all of the squashes in a pile in the center of the room. "Kib, burn them," said Doren. An hour later, Doren was still sitting in his folding chair, watching the embers from the burned squashes and other foul glow, and slowly go out. Kib stood beside him. "That was a close call, boss," said Kib. "Too close. To think that one stupid mistake could have brought an end to all of this. We are far from invincible, even with all of our success, and I feel like I'm getting too old to defend against all of the uncertainty," said Doren. Kib said nothing as Doren poked the embers with his sword. The glowing fuel reminded Doren of the eerie glowing pits in hell. "I stare at these bottomless pits down there. Sometimes it's unsettling, and I swear the more I do, I start to see things in them." "Like what?" asked Kib, a little bit surprised that Doren was having such a reflective moment. "I'm not sure," said Doren. Doren paused for a moment before continuing his thought. "Do you ever wonder why demons never come up out of them?" "Not really. I'm just glad they don't. Maybe it's better not to ask," said Kib. "Maybe." He let out a long exhale through his nose. He got up stretching his aching back. "I hate knowing things," said Doren. First of Granite, year 372, 300th year of Archcrystal. Doren's legacy. Moldath and Iton waited impatiently for the tricentennial ceremony to begin. Over the last few decades, they had settled into a middle age without effort or noticeable fatigue. In fact, most would say that they were just now in their prime, having accomplished so much already. They had each been bestowed with titles for their battle prowess, which they both delighted in. They looked at each other and sighed. "Doren would have hated a ceremony like this," said Iton. "And that's why he's not here," says Moldath. 8 years ago, Doren Lashgroove, the sheriff of Archcrystal, seemed to realize his time was coming to an end. Well into his 150s, he began to mutter to himself, withdrawing from society even more than usual. He still carried out his duties with the usual efficiency, but his mind seemed disturbed by something only he could understand. While they passed by his quarters, the dwarves could hear him talking to himself, saying cryptic phrases to no one in particular. "I can't slip back," he would whisper. "I can't slip back into the immense design of things." The dwarves would pretend to not hear and continue on. He would be seen in the kitchens collecting random items like buckets or cave wheat, supposedly furnishing his room, as some had suggested. Every so often he would pass by the new library and mutter into his cloak, "The letters and numbers, they mean more than we think." And he would eat alone in the dining hall, talking constantly to his feet. "It's the way we survive, the way we exist." Most would politely move away. Despite his ramblings, Doren seemed very focused during drills and demon hunts, but his age was slowing him down. At last, the next year, Doren the sheriff passed away from old age. He was laid to rest in the glass tower, with his folding wooden chair propped up next to him against the wall. Moldath and Iton prepped his funeral, a grand ceremony that Doren would have hated also, and they giggled at this. At the same time, Etur and their militia commander had taken on the role of Duchess, after the title had been given to the merchant centuries ago. Etur named her own choice for captain of the guard to replace Doren, Burr. Burr was a lawful dwarf, but not very capable and a poor marks dwarf. The others followed Burr only out of necessity. It was not long afterwards that Archcrystal was officially named the Mountain Home, despite having the crown for over 200 years already. The following years were very productive. The farms and hospital were finished. The Wild Belly, a tavern in the middle of the fortress, opened for business. Many marriages were held following its opening, and it only seemed to attract goblins from the nearby dark fortresses, who laughably pretended that they were not spying. But they were tolerated until a siege came, and then they were quickly dispatched. The library was also finished, even though the dwarves of Archcrystal had no idea how to make books. The furniture had centuries of writing and pictures on them anyway, and as the population grew, so did the appetites of the dwarves. It was becoming obvious that Ruthver's would not be enough to provide a steady supply of meat. Fortunately, a mate was captured for the two hydras already in captivity, and a breeding program was started. King Yushrir was starting to show his age as well, and he made a habit of getting drunk and belligerent in the tavern every night. One night, he decided to pick a fight. Unfortunately for him, he targeted Moldath. As so often with happy-and-go-lucky people, Moldath had quite a temper, and when provoked, and besides being a deadly opponent in battle, she was not one to care where the challenge came from. The fight was brief. After exploding the king's throat with a single punch, she went merrily on her way, as if nothing untoward had just happened. And not even Aerith, the captain of the guard, gave even a thought to arresting her. And so ended the reign of Yushrir Dyke Guards. Many said he was about to die anyway, given his age, but now a problem came about. Who to name the next king, as Yushrir never fathered any children. It was decided to avoid this problem in the future, and Ingiz Lashkindled was named the new king. Ingiz was the widower of Asob Bolt Tactician, who was the renowned title of birthing the most children in the fortress. She gave birth 46 times, and Ingiz was almost near the end of his life. The rest of them knew it, but at least he had a line of offspring that could take over the throne. And this created another problem, however. In the dwarven culture, it was not simply the eldest child who was the rightful heir, but the most qualified of them. So for the next year, great debates were held in the tavern as 46 children played the Game of Thrones. A year later, Ingiz died, and his son Zan, Guildlinks, at the age of 17 inherited the throne. It was hoped that he would marry one of his cousins and continue the line. The 300th anniversary had come, and another goblin siege with it. And once again, Moldath and Eiton grinded them into paste. They brushed off bits of bone and brain from their armor as they waited for the celebration to begin. "I wonder if the new king will be any good," said Eiton, waiting her turn to march in the parade. "I don't think it matters," replies Moldath. "Why? Because you'll punch that one to death too?" says Eiton. "He started it," smiled Moldath. "What would Doren have said if he were alive? 'Bout you punching the king to death, says Eiton. Moldath responds with, "He probably would have made me clean it up." And Eiton says, "Darn right he would." Moldath replies, "Too bad he didn't have any kids. They might have made a good king." And Eiton responds, "Well, he didn't. We'll just have to live with this one." Trumpets blared and the procession marched through the halls, waving banners. Moldath and Eiton led the way, missing the former sheriff. But, unbeknownst to them, Doren Lashgroove had made plans that were maturing even now. First of Moonstone, year 361. 291st year of Archcrystal. The last child of Asob. Fath Ringed Dimple was born in the winter of 361, 11 years before the 300th anniversary of Archcrystal. He was the 46th child of Asob Bolt Action and Ingiz Lashkindled. And as it turns out, it was the last, as 3 months later, Asob died in her sleep. Fath as a baby continued on seeming to value his independence, and there seemed something special about him, bright and clever with a sharp stare, that made him look older than the infant he was. He would wander the halls and smooth slayed floors of hell on his own, crawling along without a cry or a whimper. It was the stare that caught Doren the sheriff's attention. He knew his time was coming. He decided he needed to pass on some knowledge, and he started by feeding him and bringing him water. When he grew a little older, Doren would talk to him in his room. "I can't slip back. I can't slip back into the immense design of things. My name will come again, but I won't remember. Someone has to drive them. Otherwise, everything will fade away." He would collect cave wheat in buckets in the kitchen for him, so he would have something to eat while he led the drills. Fath would hide his cloak And as they passed the library, Doren would say, "The letters and numbers, they mean more than we think. If you look hard enough, you can see them moving. You can see things for what they are, and then you can direct them and save them from themselves." In the dining hall, Fath would sit under the table while Doren spoke. "It's the way we survive, the way we exist. They need a purpose and an enemy. Otherwise, the whole thing crumbles. Keep directing and don't stop. If you do, you're just the immense design of something else." The other dwarves of Archcrystal would not know any of this. They had no idea what Fath would become. Third of Limestone, year 392, 320th year of Archcrystal, 40th annual Squash Burning Day. "Happy Squash Burning Day," says everybody. The greeting was repeated many, many times to Usim Casmuth, as he was invited down to the tavern for a drink, and to wait for the king's audience. He wasn't exactly sure why they light great bonfires of squashes every year at this time. It seemed like a waste of good food, but the dwarves knew he had plentiful stocks of exotic ingredients, and their meals were as decadent as they come. Newborn Hydra was a delicacy unmatched by anything they had ever eaten. Flanked by his guards, he left the caravan to conduct business with the dwarves of Archcrystal, and he knew from experience that down meant a fair bit more here than in other dwarven fortresses. This time, on his descent, he remarked how far the glass tower had come. It had climbed upwards like a frozen hand, clawing its way to the surface, yearning to be free and unleash its inhabitants upon the world. It stretched over 60 stories, up now from the unimaginable depths where horrible nightmares made their home. It was down here that Usim was led. Descending the great tower of glass, he could see into other worlds, large caverns that stretched for eternity into alien lands, and then past another layer of rock, only to open another world of caverns. The tower was now served as a portal between worlds and ecosystems. Finally, he could see through the walls into the great magma sea that covered the semi-molten bedrock through onto the horizon. But still they went down, at last reaching the entrance hall. Finally, the tavern. It was here, in the heart of hell, and the dwarves of Archcrystal found solace in merrymaking. Usim could see everything, as it was all made of glass, into bedrooms, chambers, storerooms, jail cells. He could see through to the outer walls, where the demons swirled against them in a determined frenzy to gain entry somehow. Whatever artful technique the dwarves used to make glass unbreakable seemed to confound their enemies, and Usim hoped it would last. The meeting with the king was uneventful, as it usually is. Usim worried about the recent attack of the elves on Archcrystal. At last it seemed the elves of the circumstantial dune had had enough of their clear-cuts, and the dwarves used to feed their furnaces. They attacked Archcrystal 2 years ago with over 100 of their best archers, and none of them survived. The elves made a hasty alliance with the goblins, who sent yearly sieges attempting to take the fortress. It was said that the goblins feared the dwarves and might invade their capital of hate-joined, not from above, but from below. The idea of a marching dwarven army through hell to take a slayed tower from beneath would seem absurd to any who did not know the dwarves here. Their brand of insanity was exceptional in this place. After a few dwarven ales and stories that continued to boggle his mind, Usim and his guards ascended the tower towards the surface to return home to the normal world. One of his guards turned to him and remarked, "I'm worried that when they complete their big tower, the demons might come out of it." "I'm not," replied Usim. "I'm worried that when they complete their big tower, the dwarves might come out of it." 15th of Hematite, year 408, 336th year of Archcrystal. Artifacts of Piety. Fath Ringed Dimple, the last child of Asob Bolt Action, sat cross-legged in a meditative trance in front of the artifact door. Cross Addicts was the single entrance to the fortress from hell, and Fath would often sit before it, determined to unlock its mysteries. It glowed with an ancient markings of his ancestors, and it was an unbreakable barrier between Archcrystal and the swirling legions of demons. He would sit and watch intently as the military often cleared demons from the entrance with ruthless efficiency. The thick glass walls distorted their bodies into even weirder shapes, blending into one another, casting shadows from eerie glow of the pits. The shadows danced upon the young dwarf's face, his eyes darting back and forth between the impossible shapes as they fought. He was obsessed with the study of these artifacts of which his ancestors had created. Fath himself was one of the last to create an artifact in Archcrystal. The art was seemingly lost to the next generation, its inspiration spent. He was convinced that there were answers within this seemingly random pictures and decorations of the founders, and it would be him that discovered their meaning. He recalled a phrase which Doren repeated to him over and over that echoed in his mind, the immense design of things. Doren warned him to not slip back into it. Fath was convinced that Doren had been touched by the gods and was being prophetic, and that the artifacts were keys to it all, especially the door. Fath was a young adult now, strong and determined, but devoted like no other dwarf before him. He was dedicated to the divinity of the gods, and it was this piety that set him apart from the rest of his kin. Everyone respected and communed with the gods, as it was their tradition and duty, but Fath was unique in his devotion, for he actively preached their virtues in long sermons anywhere he could. He was feverish with bright-eyed conviction and a merciless gaze. Fath began decorating new temples to each god in the South District with precision and care. He diverted what resources he could because the king and duchess were expanding the prisons in the Eastern District to deal with the many dwarves who violated production orders. The populace had stopped being able to produce all of their demands, so they were thrown into prison, and a semblance of martial law had rooted within the city. Fath found that the bitterness towards the established authority could be transformed into religious zealotry rather easily, and he smiled as his eyes drew imaginary lines across the great door. The lines hummed and throbbed as his vision distorted. He tried to make the lines blur between the demon and dwarf with his eyes, between officer and citizen, and in that moment he knew where change resided, and why his ancestors created the artifacts they did. 8th of Malachite, year 429, 357th year of Archcrystal. Awake. Fath had worked tirelessly, with spiritual conviction. The temples were nearing completion, but there were inner voices at work within his mind that he could not explain as divine guidance. They were thoughts and instructions from just beyond the conscious understanding, and a series of events over the last few years had finally made them become clear. The first event was the death of Moldath, one of the last great warriors of the mountainous castles who had survived the invasion of Hell. It left Iton as the last surviving member of the great battle. Iton missed her constant companion greatly, and gone was her bubbly personality after Moldath's death. She rarely spoke to anyone now. That is, when Fath's fragmented thoughts began, they became clearer when the glass tower reached the first riverbed. The engineers and miners, led by King Zahn himself, had a difficult task ahead of them, as the glass tower was to go through the two rivers, a waterfall, and a narrow two-level aquifer. They postulated many soldiers on how to dam the rivers, but in the end the king simply concluded to pour magma strategically on both and mine out the stone where it was needed. The aquifer was more difficult of a challenge. They began to dig down into it from above, letting the water pour into the river basin and flow downstream, and then pour magma around the edge to seal the water within the stone. They repeated this for the second level until the riverbed was completely dry, but still the voices inside of Fath were unintelligible. The king then set to channeling out the riverbed and replacing it with glass. It was then that the first rays of sunlight blazed through the immense glass spire and reached the slayed floors of hell. Fath felt as though he had been struck. He could hear it, the ground tremble with electric vibration, as though an alien heartbeat stirred to life within the ground. When he looked around, no one else seemed to be experiencing it, but he was sure it was real. Somehow, perhaps beyond their senses, he could see the eerie glowing pits pulse with hidden energies, and at last he heard a voice speak a word to him in a low, growled whisper. Armok. Fath felt himself fill with importance. Finally, he felt he was special, for he knew something that no one else did. And it rang like a bell. That sound was clear for miles, but contained as a singular constant thought within his head. Fath knew what was to be done. A grand temple to one god, his god, the god of his blood. And that's when his god came to him. Fath would be ready to serve, and control of Archcrystal would be his, and his alone. Zan the king had been aware of Fath's divine devotion for many years. However, it gave him no pause. He was an industrious king, and there was work to be done, and his engineers replaced the stone riverbed with dwarven glass. Once completed, he gave the command for the first dam to be broken and let the river flow again, through the tower and on its way downriver, just in time for heavy rains that began to refill the empty river, and then instructed honeybees to be brought down into hell, as they could finally survive in the sunlit portions of hell. At last he could slate his thirst for meat and honey, and the others nicknamed the insect demon bees, half joking that they were breeding something that would slaughter them all. Fath had fevered dreams full of reckoning and obscure reference. He could see and reach for something just beyond his sight and grasp, but never obtain. He knew the fight for Archcrystal would soon begin, the intricities stretching towards their finality, and his ambition burning with white-hot certainty. The glory would be his, and rest be damned. Even if glory was fleeting, he didn't care. They were either all damned, or the only pious few below a world of damnation who were cursed to never witness the evidence of miracles that could pierce the underworld with order and industry. Such were the dwarves of Archcrystal now. He thought blessed crusaders of architectural marvel and thieves of holy design. They would take what only gods were meant for and make it theirs, as ghosts of their ancestors watched through translucent tombs. For at last Fath understood the meaning of Armok. The one god was themselves. They, as a whole, were the great god they had been waiting for, that awoke in the sunlit hell, to design the world as they see it, and grow tired of its novelty, and then abandon it to mediocrity or oblivion or both. They would not falter, for only they could decide its fate, and design its inspired, glorious structures, fueled by divinity without limit. But Fath knew he had to unite the dwarves under its holy banner, and only then would he achieve the power that he sought. A Puritan force of godly dwarves that started with Archcrystal and spread across the world to shape and control the immense design of things. 27th of Opal, year 446th, 374th year of Archcrystal. Martial law of the mind. Zan felt he was the people's king, despite his penchant for locking up growing numbers of the general populace for longer periods of time for not meeting his mandates quick enough. The Duchess Etur and the Mayor Ast were part of his royal court, who were convinced of this as well, and on any given day there were 5 or 6 dwarves in jail for various crimes against production, as they called them. And they were seemingly oblivious to Fath's growing cult of religious zealots who worshipped the artifacts of old. Fath would pick one at random on any given week to worship. King Zan thought that since he worked with the miners, they respected him, clearing out the large areas needed for the tree farm and underground reservoir needed to irrigate it. It was a difficult engineering project requiring controlled cave-ins of 4 stories of vast spaces that were mined out around the glass tower. They also had to rebuild a strip-mined area below with stone blocks to ensure the collapse didn't extend further than they wanted. It was an enormous undertaking, spanning years of effort, and it was finally ready and the switch was pulled and the cave collapsed. After the dust cleared, the hatches were opened, and the water from the 6th-floor reservoir rushed into the artificial cavern, flooding and irrigating the ground. At last, the dwarfs of Archcrystal could clear-cut a forest that was not beset by horrible clouds up above. Etur, the Duchess, was also very fond of elaborate traps, so she constructed a magma reservoir along the long glass entrance to the tower for anyone foolish enough to assault the fortress, which still surprisingly happened once a year, at least. And above the glass tower continued to rise. Archcrystal was equally close to 4 heavily populated goblin cities, and therefore invaded frequently by all of them. The elves also assaulted Archcrystal once every few years in retribution for destroying the jungle, evil though it was, and always the following year, with their caravan, would arrive wanting to trade, as if nothing untoward had happened. When questioned about the raids, their diplomat would always reply that the attacking elves were a rogue offshoot of insurgent elves, and he called them not officially aligned with the elf queen Lysana. So, when the time came to test the magma trap at the entrance, somehow it coincided with the visit of the elvish caravan. Their screams carried well through the glass walls, but the dwarves insisted they could not hear them. The elvish diplomat looked on with horror as the last elf was pinned up against the glass door, clawing with futile desperation against it. The outpost liaison looked at the elvish diplomat and shrugged. Insurgent magma. On a sadder note, Eiton died at the age of 170, the last of the soldiers to invade Hell. Moldath and Eiton were buried side by side in clear glass tombs, decorated with countless stories of their heroic battles. Her blade, shameful intense, the heavy deterioration, passed to Kivish, who already showed a great skill with it. Many of the weapons have been passed on now between 2 and even 5 generations. Fath regarded these with reverence as well, and he incorporated their legacy into his Paths to Divinity sermons, which he gave regularly. But for a moment, Fath sat alone, in his opulent room designed by crafts dwarves centuries ago, with pictures of glory and sacrifice in every known available resource. He would regularly attempt to commune with them, but constantly disappointed. They did not seem to share his efforts for communion, and he was like a child that throws fits of tantrum, railing against what he saw, their disrespect towards him for not confining in his own beliefs. In his heart of hearts, he knew that they listened to him, and if there was no response, then it was their choice to not answer him, which made his blood boil under the surface of his normalized exterior, practiced to appear calm and serene, but to Fath, anything could be rationalized and explained, and he forced himself to believe that he could hear the things that he wanted to, through the desperation and longing for significance, which provoked him to control destiny, or at least attempted to. He had a keen self-awareness that history of the world before him was very brief, and that he could shape the story of his world for thousands of generations to come if he could only act with a lasting, permanent conviction. It was an absolute belief punctuated with hidden doubts. 19th of Galena, 473. 401st year of Archcrystal. Journal of Mayor Ast Brassnots. I am starting to witness a true marvel of creation as the tower of glass rises out of the foul jungle. It is an immense structure that I'm starting to revere the insane foresight of the Mad Queen of Librash and her brother Yushrir, as neither of them lived long enough to truly see their creation come to pass. but we are having a few minor problems, as some of the wooden furniture and furnished goods have started to disintegrate after 400 years of use. A well in the hospital was unusable after a bucket basically turned to splinters. The following day I spotted Id walking the length of the grand halls below the fort. Out of something of a morbid curiosity, I tailed her for a time, and I think she was aware of me, but said nothing, as she stepped into the Slade cavern below. I could only see her briefly tense up before inspecting our cave dragons. Rare you see them at this size. You guys have been here a while, I take it? Startled, I responded, just a short 375 years to the day. She stopped dead in her tracks and stared at me. She blinked. Do you have a library? I nodded and led her to the inky bowels. A center of knowledge and learning. Erish was sitting at one of the tables, pondering the meaning of stars or some other nonsense like that, and he completely ignored us for a moment. Where are the books? Books? I asked. I'm sorry, madam. We don't have any of those books you speak of. How do you record things, then? You know, history and such. With the occasionally stone tablet, but they're too bulky to use for anything beyond basic organization. Id pinched the bridge of her nose for a moment. I thought she was going to lash before letting out an exasperated sigh. Come with me. I'm going to give you the best gift I can. Leading us to the main hall, she grabbed a bunch of pigtails and began to ground them in a quern before adding water. I watched her take the slurry and begin pounding it into a paste with a screw press, watching carefully to make sure that she extracted all of the water out of the slurry and then spread the rolls out on a nearby craft shop. As they hung, she asked me where she could find some coal or possibly charcoal, something black. Curious on what she was thinking, I located a lump lying near the original smelters and handed it to her. Taking out a dagger, she grounded the coal into a black powder with the hilt and then poured it into a goblet and retrieved a rock feather from our stalks at the base. She cut it and then dipped it into the coal slurry. Let's see if I did this right, she says. With a practiced hand, she began to write on the dried pigtail slurry and created recognizable letters and characters. Good. Now pay attention. This is how you preserve yourself and everything you were. And motivated for us to return to the library. Sitting at a desk, she began to write. Erish walked over and watched in amazement. So this is called paper, said Erish. Yeah, something I learned in a place very far away, says Id. On the quire, which is what she called the stack of papers, Id wrote a detailed list of instructions detailing the creation of paper via pigtail slurry, as well as 2 additional methods on creating parchment with a substance known as quicklime, and a method involving specific types of papyrus plants. Additionally, she listed designs for a new type of item she called a bookcase, methods of binding quires in longer-lasting codexes. That should cover most of it. I think now we should bind this properly into an actual book. And with that, the first codex of Archcrystal came into existence, which became later known as Liberium Premium. Over the next several days, many of the scholars began committing their thoughts to paper. Id spoke very little and simply wandered as a ghost in the library. A week later, I spotted Id filling her backpack with supplies and refilling her water skins. Leaving already? I asked. Yeah. I'm not needed, says Id. Needed? I asked. Id shrugged. Just a thing I need to do. Rarely do I find places so close to the void filled with life. The void? I asked. Don't worry about it. It's not your problem. It was nice to stay somewhere with actual company for once, and the glass is beautiful. I didn't see much of it in my travels. You know, you're welcome to stay if you want, I said. It's within my power to grant residency here at Archcrystal, and I'm convinced that the king could grant you citizenship for your knowledge alone. I actually got a small grin out of her. What, me? Knowledge? I'm just a Marks dwarf who learned a bit in her travels, and I might remember a bit of siege operations, though. I actually glared at her. One who possibly revolutionized the sharing of storage of knowledge. You're as much a Marks dwarf as I am a king. She shrugged and continued to load her supplies. That wasn't enough to stop me. Where are you from, and where are you going? I asked. That got her attention. Asked. I've walked the infinite plains for far, far longer than you realize. There are some things that you are simply better off not knowing. My home was destroyed in a fit of madness and depravity long ago. I am all that remains. I tried to respond, but no words came to me. Use what I taught you. Preserve your knowledge for future generations, and let it spread throughout the world. Everything ends, Ast. Everything. Even this place will eventually. It may not be for years to come, but it will. Let the legacy of Archcrystal and its history and its stories and its knowledge live on. It holstered her backpack. I'll leave in the morning, one final drink, and a nice bed to rest in before I continue on. Unable to think of anything to say, Id followed to the tavern. She didn't say much aside from minor disappointment for not having a fisherberry wine in the stocks. And then the following morning, I walked up with her on the flight of stairs leading to the jungle. There is nothing I can say to convince you to stay? No, but perhaps, just perhaps, we may meet again, Ast. May the world itself protect this place. I thought I should say something, or perhaps stop her, but in the end, I simply watched her walk into the distance and disappear between the trees. Fifth of Hematite, year 477, 405th year of Archcrystal. The Elven War. For years, the elves of the circumstantial dune had raided Archcrystal and lied that the raiders were outsiders, criminals, or insurgents. At last, Zan, the king of the dipped spears, had enough of their insolence. In the year 476, he commanded the Scaly Clasps to raid the elven retreat of Bolt Canyons to the northeast, to teach the fools a lesson. When they arrived, the dwarves were unlike anything the simple tree folk had ever seen. Fully armored from head to toe in adamantine that had been forged in hell and decorated for hundreds of years, their weapons blazed and dazzled in the sunlight. The elves gathered around them like moths to a flame. With a nod from his commander, Dagal Rockfishers, the moral stone of the enchanted, seized the first elven noble he spotted and threw him to the ground. When he was sure he had everyone's attention, he executed the elf amid the gasps and cries of the elven villagers, and the dwarves of Archcrystal left without a word. Queen Lasanza of the elves was quick to declare war with her anger and gathered her armies. In the year 477, elven hordes descended on Archcrystal, making their way expertly through the dense jungle. King Zan expected the retaliation, but this was no raiding party of a few dozen elves. The scouts spotted them pouring over the eastern ridge, and their numbers were too great to hide, even in the thick jungle. The alarm was sounded, and the mountainous castles and scaly clasps took their positions in the north end of the glass entrance of the tunnel. 2 reserve squads were activated as well, the granite torches and the last palisades, and sent to the front line. The elves with their war animals brazenly marched straight into the tunnel, and at halfway, the dwarves and elves charged at each other. The dwarven line of adamantine and steel met the elven line of wood and cloth with devastating effect. The first dozen elves were quickly cut down, and giant tigers and cheetahs leaped across their corpses, clashing into the dwarven wall of metal, attempting to push back the line with their weight, as more elves and animals passed from behind them. The dwarven weapons were ruthlessly efficient, hacking and slashing through animal and elf alike. As the squads began to join the fray, and the enemy flowed like a river over the eastern ridge into the tunnel. At the center of the line, the champion of Archcrystal, Kivish Sect Cudgel, the portal of universes, wielding his Iton's old sword, shameful intense, the heavy deterioration, slicing through enemies like a cold machine of death. The front line became a wall of piled corpses, with either side having to climb over bodies and wade through severed limbs to reach their targets. And so far, it was all one-sided. At last, the cave dragons of war were brought up to the entrance by their trainers, and they charged the mounds of dead that nearly reached the ceiling of a 3-story tunnel, crashing through their immense 400 years of size. They sent limbs and bodies flying through the air as they burst through the front line and into the terrified elvish army, which was now too committed to turn around and flee. The dragons gleefully flung screaming elves from their mouths to splatter against the glass of the tunnel that were now stained red for almost the entire length and height. The sun shining into it gave an eerie reddish glow, making the dwarves who resided in hell feel at home. And still the enemy came relentlessly. The horrified elves at the front line, wishing to flee the carnage, were being pushed from behind by the funneling mass of elvish arrogance. Blood began to pool on the flat surface of the glass tunnel, ankle deep now, making the dwarves fight in a swamp of massacred fools. At last, a dwarf fell. Having advanced too far into the elves, he got surrounded and passed out from exhaustion. An elf ripped his helmet off, and finally the enemy had a victory over one of the defenders. But by now, it was too late. The last squads of the invaders began to notice an odd elf fleeing in terror into the jungle, and eventually they saw carnage inside that was near the entrance now. It didn't take long before the rout was on. The cave dragons enthusiastically chased many of them into the jungle, batting them to the side like insects eating them whole. Tired, but victorious, the dwarves of Archcrystal collected the body of their fallen comrade and slowly made their way back inside. They counted the dead, almost 900 elves and 500 war animals. The bodies would take months to dispose of. Hours later, a dwarven caravan came to trade, and they made their way to the depot without remorse or surprise. Eighth of Granite, year 484, the 412th year of Archcrystal, after the Elven War. Fath's mind sloped into recess, imprisoned by thoughts and insights into his mind and body. He had sought out the secrets of life and death, and was rewarded when the scaly clasps retrieved a book from the tower. Victory by Doom. He committed its text to memory. The secrets contained within the book were greater than he could ever have imagined, and held instructions on how to live forever, along with other dark powers he swore he would never use. But now he could be immortal, and he could make plans far into the future without worrying about running out of time. However, as so often with certainty and ambition, his views began to change. He lamented his desire for control of Archcrystal as the friends and family he knew passed away from old age. And he saw a longer picture of time now, one that he wasn't certain that he could shape. Fath fell into despair with his secret library at the bottom of hell, unsure of his former path to destiny. He had been certain that the fight for Archcrystal would be his primary goal forever, but as forever loomed in his consciousness, thoughts he began to see it futile. So he became reclusive in his texts and waiting for inspiration. As the world around him plunged onward, he stopped giving sermons and recruiting others to his cause. Given an eternity to complete anything made nothing worthwhile, so he looked inward, trying to make sense of nonsensical desires. He refused to share this burden with anyone, hiding the book of secrets from anyone else because he judged that the reasons for immortality were crushed by infinite time. And worse, this reasoning seemed adolescent to him, persisted by the thought that anyone in his position had reasoned this as well, and reached the same conclusions. What he thought was the purpose of his life became vague and superfluous. But, as with all depressions, the answer was plain to all but him. Had he been able to witness himself from only a few years hence? It was this Elven War of 477 that renewed his convictions, and even now he would say it was an odd recollection. As the battle waged, he perched himself in the glass tower, watching the fight and pondering its importance. He was sure that the dwarves would be victorious given the tactics and weaponry, and his feelings of futility suddenly became trivial in the face of dwarven warriors fighting for their lives, as well as the elves screaming in terror and crying for their mothers to save them as they were pressed into the dwarven wall of death. Fath saw the gift that immortality was. He saw the commitment to a longer goal that eludes even those blessed with a long life. He saw the opportunity to plan the plan of forever, which very few had the insight to consider. But most of all, he saw the work and the chance was offered to him to complete it. Very few had. He smiled wryly as he recognized, finally, what Doren had been trying to teach him. The absolute, effective ruler by design. He must be the leader who ruled forever, the immense design of things. To die meant to give control and trust. Otherwise, you are the immense design of someone else. With renewed purpose, Fath descended to his dwarven family with reconditioned commitment to guiding them into forever, no matter what forever meant. His was now a certainty that spanned uncertainty and zeal. There was nothing more dangerous to the world than this. And now he started his sermons. He recognized that his believers were not those to be converted forever, but to be used in the here and now. A recognition he no longer regretted. To use his followers was no longer a meager selfishness, but a realization that they served the lengthened efforts, and it was strengthened by the fact that they could hold the immensity of design, which he now held. Being above them was not a truth he would admit, and it held no attachment to his heritage or birthright. It was simply a product of his own desires, who would fail examination to anyone but him, forged by his ambition, withstood by the assaults of eternity and reason. This reason would not last in the face of rational argument, but it did not matter to one who could outlast all of his opponents. It was they, and not him, who would slip back into the immense design of things, along with everyone else, until he was alone with perfection, and most of all, divinity. 27th of Moonstone, 493, 421st year of Archcrystal. The World Crusades. War had come to Archcrystal from all centers of the world. Goblins and elves were a constant nuisance, and finally the humans of the Confederacy of Fining decided to try their luck at throwing themselves against the glass spire. Their diplomat said the excuse for declaring war was a caravan that had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. King Zen knew well, as lawgiver, that the traitors had been caught in a cloud of wicked soot. Such was the risk of trading in the haunted jungle. The humans sent many raids to Archcrystal, but they were all thwarted, especially by the wielder of Indigo Spark, Limul City Mystery, the oily love of covers, who whispered a prayer to the mountain god Onul Diamondbeak before each engagement. O Lord, of the mountain, lend us your strength. Steel our resolve and fortify our courage. Guide our hand against your enemies. Grant us the courage of our forefathers, and let none stand against us. For Onal, for Archcrystal. The battles were brief, and the humans were routed easily, but this left the dwarves and the dipped spears with no allies left in the world. But rather than despair this turn of political isolation, King Zan reasoned that it was inevitable. The treasures of Archcrystal were now too great for any civilization to ignore. Let any beast or army come to our lands and be shown that their ignorance will be abated by their last breath, he thought. And to solidify this threat, the king sent messages to every government that could be reached and declared war on them all. The armies of the world set up a permanent siege camps in some distance away from the tower in the jungle to launch ever larger raids against the dwarves. This delighted King Zan, as they would often turn to fight each other or become choked up by the clouds of wicked soot that approached silently upon the camps. Through centuries of hardship, the dwarves had earned their natural protection from the haunted land. Meanwhile, below in Hell, the dwarven nobility began to have concerns. The current population was old, and the baby boom after the invasion of Hell had almost run its course. The generation below them did not want to marry, preferring casual romantic relationships, and they saw children as too much effort for it to become unfashionable within circles of the young elite. So the population of Archcrystal began to slowly dwindle. For every 4 deaths, there were only 3 births, and only 3 married couples remained. This was also causing an increase in the general stress of the populace. Dwarves sank into depression more easily, and their decadence failing to give them meaning. And they searched for an outlet. Some became so disillusioned they threw tantrums, causing fistfights or committed vandalism, even in the temples. And luxuries of fine meals and drink and expensive furniture could no longer satisfy them as their threshold for happiness clawed ahead of their material extravagances. The fortress guard were busy, administering beatings of petty crimes, some lethal, and the mayor was also busy counseling the troubled and trying to maintain order. For now, the situation was manageable, but dissent was slowly growing. King Zan decided to begin a public works program, hoping that the common goal of labor would reunite them. He commissioned a large covered road to be built around the perimeter of the tower. The public reason for this would be to protect any future caravans from the horrible clouds that drifted through, but the private reason was that it would funnel any invading force through the road and into the main glass tunnel of the fortress, giving the defending dwarves cover from the sunlight. However, if this did not improve the mood and loyalty of the citizens of Archcrystal, the king had another plan. He would institute a forced marriage decree, imprisoning couples in their rooms until they agreed to wed. And it was something their forefathers had done centuries ago to ensure the survival of Bomrek's pure bloodline, and it could be done again. The armies that camped nearby sat beside their evening cookfires as their leaders planned different ways to take the tower and conquer its vertical empire that stretched from heaven to hell. But the soldiers could see the glass spire rising in the distance, even at night, for it glowed red from the pits of hell, which reflected through the ascending glass, and not to mention the blood that now stained the entrance from the countless fallen soldiers. Their leaders did not have to look upon it, so they could see crimson light, and pulsed rhythmically through the glass, a beacon of doom that called the armies of the world to it, like insects to a horrible fire. And that flame within its impenetrable glass heartbeat relentlessly through the dark moonless sky. The soldiers would shudder, because more than anything else in the world, this unforgiving tower was the real reason that they now feared the night. 21st of Felsight, year 502, 430th year of Archcrystal. Order and industry. It was migrant day at Archcrystal. and they descended down into the fortress for the first time in 4 centuries. Stinthad marched down the immense glass staircase of the tower, marveling at the structure along with the other refugees that she followed. She heard King Zan's proclamation that the spire was accepting newcomers, although briefly she came to see for herself how the capital had flourished and withstood their infinite enemies. She had listened intently as the messenger to her refugee camp had described the king's final offensive against all the enemies of the dwarves, calling on all who were willing to fight to come over to the tower at last to strike back against civilizations of the world who would dare attack the Eternal Fortress. The first attacks against the goblins of the Feral Doom came swiftly and conquered the northern pits, catching the enemy off guard and unprepared. The battles were fierce and short, with the dwarven attackers being far better equipped and trained thoroughly by the skilled commanders within the tower. Most of the defenders surrendered quickly, and the rest were publicly executed in front of the former strongholds. They were determined to aid their vertical empire of glass and its inevitable and crushing reach outwards across the land. Finally, the kingdom that had conquered hell extended its barbed roots outward to bend the weakened claims of the surface into servitude of the dwarven order. This new order of industry and design had similar motives to other conquerors, but it attacked with an efficiency that was previously unknown to the residents of the world. Battles and sieges that once took months and years now took days or merely hours. The siege camps around Archcrystal recalled their armies, such as they were now, for the defense of their own threatened territories. Fear had gripped the world as the dwarven invaders blitzed across the central continent and unchecked and undefeated. Those thoughts brightened Stinthad's descent down the glass tower into hell, a trip that was usually foreboding for newcomers. She could hear a faint shouting as she walked down the stairs through the magma sea and past the heroes of old who lay in their clear tombs of glass. Shouting became louder and more rhythmic the further she got to the entrance hall. Eventually, they were herded into the main temple, where the source of the shouting revealed itself. "All migrants come in line! Combat experience to the left! All others to the right! Children to the center! You will be reunited with your children once they reach combat age!" Kib the general barked commands at the huddled mass of newcomers. The ones with fighting experience were given command of their squads, as everyone was outfitted with armor and weapons. Zephon had been busy forging new suits of steel armor non-stop for the last year since the migrants were taken in. They lacked the ornate decoration of the suits of old, but were still embedded with hydrabone and studded with copper to give a fierce look to them. Weapons were easier to come by. The former King Ushrir Dyke Guards had been a master weaponsmith who loved spears and bismuth bronze, and he had filled his own mandates for these weapons for decades, over 150 years ago. And now they were given to the newcomers, masterpieces of all of them blazed with decorations of countless materials. And the newcomers who received them stared in awe at their new weapons, which gave them confidence created by the dwarves of Archcrystal down through the centuries. They also had the chance to gaze upon the constructions of the glass fortress in hell. The tower was completely floored, and the second level was nearing completion. Petty crimes were way down as well. The guard who was no longer delivering beatings nonstop, and the spirits of the dwarves were soaring. King Zan had successfully appeased the population at last, and the answer was so simple: war. They were united and driven by the promise of conquest and the idea that everyone outside was the enemy that every dwarf of Archcrystal shared. Why he had never thought of it before eluded him, but On the outside, it looked like a master stroke of tactics. For hundreds of years, armies of goblins had broken themselves in attempts to take the tower, and now the forces were so depleted they could not withstand the powerful dwarven offensive that was washing over their strongholds. While the mood among the citizens of Archcrystal was focused and happy, the migrants were scared and separated. Children as young as 2 were being torn from the arms of their parents and placed into general care rooms. It also looked as bad as it felt. Screaming toddlers were being forced from sobbing mothers, and many of the dwarves began to wonder out loud why this was needed. The children watched without comprehension as their parents were forcibly outfitted with weapons and armor and committed to train far away from them. The scene was a horrific blend of efficiency and raw emotion. Infants had no understanding of the events, and the parents had no way of giving them meaningful assurance. The many elaborate toys given to them were also of little distraction, as they longed for their mothers. King Zan consoled himself by thinking it was necessary, but many around him questioned his methods. "They will realize eventually that it is for the greater good," he would say. Fath was one of the first to doubt this. He raised the question with his followers, who would respond with downward looks and muted responses. He took it upon himself to confront the king and tell him their concerns. He watched closely as another squad of migrants marched out of the front gate, resplendent in their new shiny armor. He could see the longing of the parents who looked back one last time to where their children were. He shook his head and retired to his library. Edzul, the great mathematician of Archcrystal, visited Fath in the heart armory of Oblivion. It was a regular occurrence that Fath looked forward to. They would debate time and consequences for hours. Given Fath's immortality, each discussion would take on new meaning. However, Edzul was a once-in-a-generation mind capable of accurately comparing observations beyond the best scholars of the world. "Those children will grow to hate us, Fath," he says. "I agree with you, Edzul, but the king may be right. I have seen that time is infinite and therefore smooths over our concerns. In a century, they may see his views as correct." Bullshit! Grudges are not forgotten so easily. Even infinite time is constructed by boundaries. "Ha!" said Fath. "Infinite time would crush every vengeance. You, of all people, should know this. Given infinite time, everything becomes not only possible, but assured. If the chance of you being reborn is a 0.0000000%, then an infinite number of chances to create it makes it a certainty. Time may have borders that we don't know of, Fath." "And what borders could exist within infinite time?" asked Fath. Edzul sipped on his plump helmet wine thoughtfully before answering. "You are using mathematics to justify your meaning. It doesn't work like that, my friend. There is no absolutes even in mathematics. Infinite numbers do not equal infinite possibilities as much as 0 is not a void. 0 must still exist for there to be nothing." Fath drank his own wine, which did nothing for him as a necromancer. He suspected Edzul knew about his secret immortality, but said nothing, except, "You still haven't answered me," he paused, "about infinity. Think of it this way, Fath. If you take decimals, there are infinite amounts of numbers between 3 and 4. Edzul paused before taking another sip. "But yet none of them are 5. 10th of Timber, year 512, 440th year of Archcrystal. Heroes that conquer. Stinthad crept up the rocky ridge out of the ravine with her sword. There was no point in trying to be quiet with full suits of steel armor crashing about as they crest of the trench that the goblins seemed so fond of. 9 years of training, her group of 10 migrants were deemed fit to attack the pits of Word Spider to the west. While her stay in Archcrystal was brief by dwarven standards, she was glad to leave the bureaucracy and the decadence of the Crystal Spire. 440 years of isolation and inbreeding had made the city in hell almost unlivable to newcomers, as the demons had centuries ago. The nobility invented crimes to lock them in the many dungeons of the glass fortress. Disorderly conduct, vandalism, trading the wrong good, and not making enough grates for the city that had hundreds of unused ones, collecting dust in endless stockpiles. And it was almost always a migrant who broke the law, and the purebloods of the line of Bomrek and Serral being far too important and wealthy to suffer the wrath of the injustice system that a brutal and bright-eyed fanatical guard enforced with deadly fervor. And the worst part of it all, to Stinthad at least, was that there did not seem to be any retribution for their luxurious vices. In fact, they thrived under such a system, their treasures uncounted and their armies unbeaten and their souls untainted by the gods who honored them, with lavish burials and a lack of divine sanction. When she was young, she was taught in her refugee camp that the rich and elite of Archcrystal had earned their status and luxuries through difficult labor and sacrifice, and that their glorious gains of success would benefit all dwarves as the industrious rewards flowed downstream onto them, the hopeless poor. But now, as she looked upon the wretched goblin pits that she was to attack and conquer, she realized that there was no such river of affluence. Her squad stopped and formed a phalanx at the top of the trench, about 300 feet from the gates of the goblin city. She could see the green-skinned recruits rushing from the wall to wall, readying their weapons at the sight of the steel-clad dwarven invaders shining in the sunlight. Guttural orders from the parapets echoed across the lower plain before the gates, and arrows sang through the sky from behind the walls towards the dwarven formation. Stinthad and her squad barely bothered to put up their shields, as the aim of the goblins was so terrible even by their standards. Most of their copper-tipped projectiles were deflected off the dwarves like pebbles, striking a tin pot, and the rest were swatted out of the air with spears and shields. The goblins, eager to see the result of their assault, were met with no screams and no call to action, not even laughter at their impotence, but a stone-faced and unmoving stance of the disciplined dwarves, which was more terrifying than anything else. As the defenders gazed from behind their walls with the steel square of death, began to march forward slowly towards the gates. More and more arrows descended upon them with equal ineffectiveness. Yuvash, the squad leader, knew the key to a successful raid was conserving stamina of his soldiers, so there was no charge and no needless waste of energy. They steadily closed ground on front of the gates. They reached the crude copper gates with one concerned thrust of bodies. The soft hinges cracked, and the gates smashed onto the ground in front of them as the goblins prepared their meager defense in the courtyard beyond. Lined up to face the dwarves were a collection of unskilled conscripts, scared and poorly equipped. Mixing among them were captured humans and elves, and even dwarves, who had known no other life than the servitude of their captors. At the command of their goblin commander, they rushed the dwarves, who stood firmly in their formation, spears outstretched and extended in perfect lines, and the charge crashed into those horribly sharp weapons with screams and spurts of arterial blood. The limp bodies of the attackers at the front fell and slid down shafts of many bismuth bronze spears, lubricated along the way by blood and bile from internal organs, before being tossed aside like unwanted food on priceless skewers. Stinthad advanced the group of 6 defenders, whirling spear from behind her back into the neck of another's forearm, severing the tendons upon the weapon of the latter and almost decapitating the head of the former. Using her momentum, she turned a full 360 degrees, avoiding the thrust of the silver short sword from her left, and then stabbed forwards into the stomachs of 2 rushing attackers, embedding her spear in them. She thought for a moment that she could drop the weapon as she bludgeoned the teeth of her attacker to the left with the steel of her shield, before deciding to place her foot on the closest chest and yanking brutally on the weapon so it came free. Pulling back, it dislodged both victims' complete digestive systems that were now wrapped around the shaft of the centuries-old lancet that she pivoted to face the next attacker, who was screaming a high-pitched battle cry as they attacked one who had massacred their comrades in a few seconds. Stinthad was caught off guard for a moment as she realized it was a dwarf rushing at her with a well-made steel mace, striking in quick succession, which made Stinthad parry the blows awkwardly with her long spear and shield. In the next exchange, Stinthad's attacker overcommitted, and the swing downward missing her dodge, and Stinthad seized the advantage by bringing her spear in downwards in an arc over the head, which shot through her attacker's upper torso, pinning them upright to the ground. The body then slid in slow motion down the shaft of the spear towards the ground, and it stopped with a dull thud. Stinthad pulled her spear tip out of the ground and through the wound to retrieve her weapon. And as she did, the crying began. What looked like a wine skin on the dead dwarf was actually an infant's sling, out of which now crawled a baby dwarf no more than 10 months old. It was not uncommon for dwarves to take their babies into battle with them, but this was the first time she had seen it in enemy from the other perspective. The baby was screaming horribly, part in terror, part in pain, as Stinthad could see its left arm was broken and bent in an unnatural angle. With its right arm, the infant reached out towards the wound in its mother's chest, seemingly trying to stop the blood from bubbling forth, while holding its mangled left arm towards the sky to shield itself from any further strikes. Stinthad stood in shock. She had no idea what to do. The sounds of battle died down shortly afterwards, and the defenders mostly killed or fled. The other dwarves from her squad gathered around Stinthad, who looked to Yuvash with a vacant, unknowing look. There was a silence for a moment, and Yuvash smirked. "Congratulations, Stinthad. It's a boy." The dwarves laughed heartily as they walked away from her. Stinthad picked up the infant and frowned. Maybe if she was male, she would have found that funny. But she doubted it, and she went off in search of something for the baby to eat and send the standard message home about the raid. Meanwhile, about a day's travel to the east, Ezot Sharskurdor Biberbandik, the demon of hate joined, slithered down one of his immense slayed hallways. He was a gigantic lizard, but moved quickly and gracefully without a sound. His darting eyes could see well in the blackness of the tunnels, which he knew well from frequent travel. He had been worried for a number of years now, ever since the dwarves had started their march across the planet, conquering new territory every month. His goblin armies were shattered in the north. His forces seemed to give up quickly. He had recalled his forces from the south to prepare a large attack on Archcrystal, and his warriors weren't of the same caliber as the dwarves. But he concluded that overwhelming numbers would make a difference. It had left his southern front against the elves of the Vine of Tornadoes dangerously unprotected. But the dwarves were the bigger threat by far. No armies had done what they had in so little time since the early days, and Ezost remembered those. Back then, it had been easy for his goblins to raise the dwarven fortresses or an elven forest retreat, and he had led his armies personally all those years ago, until, as the centuries passed, he became satiated and overconfident. He laughed with his entourage. Upon discovering that the dwarves of the Dipped Spears had set up an outpost in the evil jungle over 4 centuries ago, the others who laughed with him were all dead now. He cursed his laziness and descended down a large stairwell surrounded by the deep, dark pit. Well, no more, he thought. It was time for these mortals to witness true power. As Ezos stood before a great door of Slade, he turned his ancient bronze key into the massive lock, and mechanisms rolled and strained as the door pulled itself open. The eerie glowing pits beyond were warm, but their light was muted by mass surrounding it. 10,000 demons swarmed and gathered around the entranceway to Hate Joined. Ezost allowed himself a scaly smirk. If the attack above was not enough, his attack from below surely would be. 28th of Obsidian, year 517, 445th year of Archcrystal. Pride and numbers. Edzul Ironsword was about to die. The legendary mathematician of Archcrystal lay in the glassed hospital within Hell, and received visits by his loved ones until there was no one present besides the doctors. Edzul was confused by his impending death. He didn't understand it from a logical point of view. He did not want to die. Whatever traits he could pass on to his children wouldn't be degraded if he continued to live, and he still had contributions to make to his field of study. He had tried to convince himself that the order of things demanded that everything renew itself, but he still couldn't reason past the flaws of having a mind such as his fail because of a body that couldn't keep up. What was pride? Was it his own stupidity compared with, as Fath would say, the immense design of things? As smart as he was compared to his time, the lasting question that haunted him was this: is his intelligence even worthwhile compared with what could be known? That question seemed juvenile to him, yet he couldn't, despite its relevance. It was staggering to him to think that in a century other scholars would make discoveries far surpassing anything he could begin. And yet, it was inevitable. Edzul felt envy like he'd never felt before, and he hated it. And worse, he hated the regret that all of this came with the selfish pandering of his own perceived worth. Fath sensed this as he kneeled gently beside his longtime friend's bedside. Edzul's voice was raspy and slow as he spoke, much misshapen collection of words that came of it. There's no destiny for me here. There's none for any of us. All of our ancestors will be forgotten as you will be, as I will be. All of my work will contribute to a dying project, one that is not destroyed by infinite time which you prescribe to, but by the walls that contain it. Stupid, stupid, stupid pride. I have wished for it to listen to my reason, but it can't. It knows no such sentiment. Above all of this rambling, listen to me. Edzul coughed and sputtered. His lungs were wrecked with pain. The doctors were already bringing over sheets to lay over his lifeless face when Fath waved them off and leant closely with his ear pressed towards Edzul's lips, and Edzul whispered sharply, "You won't become the singularity with the void. Don't even try." Fath looked downwards upon Edzul's glossy eyes. "What if I can?" "You won't," said Edzul. And Edzul, the great mathematician of his time, exhaled one last breath with those words and passed into a blueprint of life that was not his own. One that he saw was corrupt and unfair. With all the rage of an adolescent teen raging against adults, Edzul passed unceremoniously into death, still convinced of his own importance despite the knowledge of its intellectual insignificance. In the end, he couldn't help feeling that he would have ridiculed others for the same behavior. His last emotion ended up being one of regret. In a perfect world, these thoughts and desires would have died with him, and his legacy would have been simply a great scientist whose mind had been disrupted by sickness and old age. If it were not for Fath, who resonated with Edzul's final thoughts. His wisdom had mixed so much with his pride, it was difficult for anyone to separate the two. So Fath accepted these final moments as reason. Edzul was, after all, the last of Fath's childhood friends, and easily the closest one of these. Fath had a good memory, and a part of him that was still mortal longed for the days between them was a series of toys and games, and the toys were weapons now, and the games were deadly. Both held the desires of a person that cannot be reached anymore. The fortress of Archcrystal continued to expand in hell, down from its entrance, less like a virus now and more like a dead animal bleeding out the glass walls and floors from a hook downwards into the ground. It spread continuously and relentlessly with a steadied pace that began to worry the demons, until there appeared something never before seen in their history, such as it was. Great columns of them flowed across the pits and plains of Slade. Their numbers were seemingly infinite. Small skirmishes broke out with the ones that had organized and the ones that hadn't. The ones that hadn't didn't last long. It was a force that stood at the gates of the dwarven invaders that had never been formed before. It was controlled and steady, like the rhythm of an ancient forgotten heart that had compensated for an apartheid exercise. They surrounded the bottom of Archcrystal completely and stared through the glass structure before them. It was a malevolent gaze tinged with awe, but focused against the scurrying creators inside. Aerith, the captain of the guard, looked upon the mass assembled outside and ordered his guard to take position behind their fortifications. The demons were shredded with bolts until no more advanced, and the majority of the hoods stood beyond their reach, waiting and planning. For a while no one moved besides the flutter of a wing or the aim of an adjacent crossbow, and then the invading horde rushed the ancient door. The collective force shook the foundations of the fortress as the indestructible door remained unblemished. But the connective architecture that held it to the glass walls strained audibly under the sheer force of a functionally infinite number of attackers. The sounds of the glass under so much pressure echoed through hell like a massive glacier beginning to crack far below its surface. More wickedly, barbed projectiles tore through the immense bodies, crashing the entrance. The sheer mass of tissue and bone and muscle created an effective barrier no matter what material it was composed of, and the glassmakers and masons quickly reinforced its support. On the other side, it was a war of manufactured attrition. Now, as both sides set against each other, working to undo the other's efforts, several hours, it was clear that there would be no clear winner. The demons again receded to their ranks beyond the eerie glowing pits, but they stood in rank, unlike anything the dwarves had ever seen. They waited with narrowed eyes, wondering what the demons were thinking, when suddenly the glass wall shook like an earthquake. Projectiles of all kinds smashed against the entrance. Acid, poison, fire, webbing, poisonous acidic webs on fire. There was no end to the constant barrage of organic bullets that pelted the fortress. If it was one thing that the demons had learned from the dwarves of Archcrystal, it was patience. Persistent attack would eventually sap the walls through consistency of effort. Such was the advantage of their immortality. They were committed by their knowledge of dwarven lifespans and were constant to wear away the defenders before them, without relent, like a river carving its way through a canyon of shaped glass. In a way, the dwarves had made them more dangerous, in that they now understood the value of the concentrated effort over time, and a realization that nothing was able to withstand the strategy and determination of those that are endless in both life and will. The dwarves were doomed. Had it not been for one who recently came to understand the concept of existence, were forever held a reality. Fath's detriments became his strengths, and his esoteric arguments over infinite time became the backbone of the defender's resolve. As he stood at the gates of hell, looking through the walls of Archcrystal, he was about to attempt something he swore he would never do. Oh, good lord, this one took forever. The total recording time on this was about 4 hours, including re-records, and the total amount of editing time was probably about 5 hours or so. I just want to say a real quick thank you to anybody who watched this video to the end. If you actually did, seriously, please consider sharing this video, sending it to your friends, or just posting it on a subreddit somewhere, or upvoting it if you happen to see it. Maybe post it on a social media platform, because there's absolutely no way in hell I'm going to make back the amount of hours I did in, like, ad revenue on this video. So thank you very much for watching. It means a lot, and I hope to be able to attempt other massive projects like this. My back hurts. It's almost 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm gonna render this and go to bed now. Bye.